Hello and welcome to our next module. In this module, we're going to be discussing Constitutional Convention divisions and compromise. So let's get started. In the convention, there are really a couple of divisions we just need to call out. This is pretty straightforward and simple. First, large versus small states. We've already touched on this a little bit, but it's worth explicitly calling it out again. Uh, Representation, and really implicit with that is the give back of sovereignty to some degree. So we saw that with the kickoff of the Virginia plan and the rebuttal with the New Jersey plan, but large versus small states. Second, we haven't really talked about this, but economics, north versus south. And that's one thing we do need to remember, that at the time it was an agrarian society. Most of the wealth was in the South at this point, but also, as we'll see here in a minute, there is the moral element to this with slavery that was part of the convention as well. Now we come to the Connecticut Compromise, which kind of split the baby, so to speak, to at least get through the convention so there is some sort of agreement that people can sign off on. That is one thing I want to mention here. I'll mention this probably in future modules as well. It was touch and go through the whole convention. Even at the 11th hour, there was some talk about, hey, let's just scrap this thing, go home for a couple months, come back, start new. But there definitely was a sense of urgency, because a lot of the crowd believed they didn't have that kind of time. If they didn't come up with something to fix all the ills that they were living on the Articles of Confederation, everything was going to collapse, and the British would have been right. Everything would have been a failure, and who knows, might have gone back to the British as society collapsed. Now, with the Connecticut Compromise, it really, what we see here gets down to what we have today in terms of Congress. The House of Representatives would be based on population, and the Senate would be based on 2 per state. Now, one thing to point out, originally, the Senate was selected by the state legislatures, not through general election. And I find this kind of interesting that with the kickoff of the convention through the Virginia plan, it looked like at that point with that proposal, that sovereignty give back I was telling you about in previous modules was going to favor the large states for the small states. But in this case, it actually helped the small states. Even think about today. In the House of Representatives, it's pretty much based on population and so forth. So each state proportionally has appropriate representation. However, in the Senate, teeny Vermont carries the same weight as big, large California. So from that standpoint, if you're a resident of Vermont, in general, between both houses, you have a little bit more representation than someone who lives in California when you look at how the Senate is composed. Now, one part of the Connecticut Compromise, we talked about this in the previous module, a 3/5 component to the New Jersey plan. We see that again here in the Connecticut Compromise. Slaves were to be counted with a ratio of 3/5 for the purposes of representation. Again, as I told you in the previous module, there is a logical inconsistency with those who are advocating for this. They were considering slaves to be property, as well as they were wanting to count them with this ratio for the purposes of representation. Now, one thing to point out here, and again, there definitely was a moral component to all this conversation regardless. Even though those who opposed slavery, again, it speaks to the severity, urgency of the times that they're willing to engage in this, but there definitely was within the convention the moral conversation. With that, I want to finish off this module with a discussion of something that you may not be aware of. Article 1, Section 9. All right, let me go to the next slide. Article 1, Section 9. A lot of times in my classes, I'll just, at this point, I just won't even tip my hand on what I'll be covering. I'll just open the textbook and flip to Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution and read it. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation not exceeding $10 for each person. I usually read that a couple times and may ask, what does this refer to? A lot of times I'll get something, maybe immigration, but really what we're talking about here is slavery. In the convention, there was talk about how to handle slavery, and we talked about the Three-Fifths Compromise within the Connecticut Compromise, but the framers of the Constitution were very, very sensitive to this issue, and even to the point they wanted to make sure that nowhere in this document would you see the word slave or slavery, even though we address it here. Now, let me explain to you what was explained to me some odd years ago when I was sitting in your chair taking this class. At the time of the convention, it was assumed slavery was going away. As an economic institution, forgive me for just putting the morality off to the side for a second, but aside from the moral issue, from an economic standpoint, the assumption was slavery was going away. And this section of the Constitution was basically a message to the slave states: you've got 20 years to figure out what you're going to do before the national government, before Congress will have the ability to regulate. All right. And again, I will tell you what was told to me. What happened? The cotton gin. Basically, all of a sudden, you have an invention that allowed for an institution that was no longer profitable to be profitable again. So just wanted to point this out there to you, that even though we do not see the word slave or slavery in the Constitution, slavery was definitely a hot button of topic in the convention, a discussion of morality, and it was something that was addressed here in this way. With that, that's the end of this module. Again, as always, go back and review, pause, start, restart as needed. And with that, that's the end of this module. Thank you.